today was the start of the biggest rupture in Europe since the end of World War II. The British people voted narrowly last summer to leave the European Union. Today, Britain's representative at the EU presented the formal paperwork that starts the process of the UK actually getting out of Europe, getting out of the European Union. The president of the European Union responded with a statement that ended with these 4 words, quote, "We already miss you." It will take Britain 2 years to fully extract itself from Europe, financially and legally. It will be an unprecedented process. Nobody knows how it will end up in the details. But we know the bottom line result, which is that the process will result in a smaller Europe. There's also a question as to whether the process will result in a smaller UK. And this is a big deal for us, right? This is our closest ally in the world, at least the closest ally in the world that doesn't touch our own borders. And the UK prying itself out of Europe will have the effect of breaking up Europe. It really might also break up the United Kingdom as well. Scotland now says it will vote again on whether Scotland should be its own independent country. The Scottish independence referendum did not pass a couple of years ago, but this time, if Scotland gets to vote on it again, they will be voting knowing that a yes vote to be their own independent country this time, this could be their one and only option for staying in Europe while the rest of the UK leaves, which is something Scotland really wants. Scotland voters said overwhelmingly last summer in that referendum that they did not want to leave the European Union, even as the UK as a whole voted yes. That has put perhaps more pressure than there's ever been before on this centripetal process of Scotland breaking away from the United Kingdom, becoming its own country. And then there's Northern Ireland. As you know, the island of Ireland is divided in 2. Most of the island is the independent nation of Ireland that is happily staying part of the European Union. But the 6 counties in the northeastern part of that island, the part that make up Northern Ireland, those 6 counties are part of the UK. And just like Scottish voters wanted to stay in the EU, voters in Northern Ireland wanted to stay in the EU too, but they were outvoted by the rest of the UK. If Northern Ireland stays part of the UK, they will be forced out of Europe against their will, forced out of the EU against their will. Incidentally, that will also require the border between Ireland and those 6 counties in the north. It will require that border to be fortified or built up to whatever extent is required by a border that will then be between the European Union and a non-European Union country. I'm sure the building up of that border is going to go over great in Northern Ireland. I'm sure that won't be controversial at all. So what Britain did today in starting the process of prying themselves off from Europe and splitting up the European Union, that is also adding a whole new impetus, a whole new dynamic to the age-old, bloody, bloody question of whether Northern Ireland should stay part of the UK or whether those 6 counties in the north should be part of a united island called Ireland. Troubles anyone? The 2 major multinational institutions that reshaped that whole part of the world after World War II, so we wouldn't have another World War again as quickly as World War II had followed World War I. The 2 main multinational institutions that were created to and have succeeded in staving off World War III thus far, the 2 big multinational organizations that have done the work of stopping World War III in that part of the world, the 2 big ones are NATO and the European Union. And all things considered, if you factor in military power and economic power and international influence, I think it's fair to say that the UK is the strongest and most important cornerstone member of the European Union. And now, as of today, they are starting the process of getting out. It's happening. And that alone is profoundly destabilizing in lots of ways to that part of the world and to the UK itself, who is probably our greatest ally on Earth. We are also about to have 2 hugely important elections in 2 of the other cornerstone countries of Europe. Both Germany and France are heading toward very, very important national elections, which will not just determine the immediate short-term future of politics in those countries, it'll determine whether or not Europe splits apart entirely. The strongest anti-European candidate in France is Marine Le Pen. She's the head of a French party called the Front National, the National Front, which was founded by her father in the early 1970s. Essentially, for decades, the Front National has been basically the fascist party in France. Jean-Marie Le Pen, who founded the party, he denies the Holocaust. He made a career of accusing all his political opponents of being secret Jews. He's inveighed against Muslims being allowed to immigrate to France. That's a position, incidentally, that his daughter shares as she campaigns to be president of France now. Part of her campaigning to be president of France last week resulted in her taking a detour to the Kremlin. It's a weird day. Nobody quite knew where Marine Le Pen had gone for the day, and then she suddenly turned up without warning in this meeting with Vladimir Putin, this one-on-one. The Russian government is essentially openly supporting the far-right National Front candidacy of Marine Le Pen as she runs for president in France. Russian banks have made loans of millions of euros to the Front National during this campaign. Today, at their press conference on the Senate Intelligence Committee's investigation into the Trump-Russia connection, Intelligence Committee Chairman Senator Richard Burr said there was no doubt that Russia was trying to influence the outcome of the presidential elections in Germany and in France. He said there was no doubt that Russia, after interfering in our election, was now interfering in Germany and France. And in the case of this fascist candidate in France, you know, it is possible that the reason Russia likes her so much is because of her domestic politics, because her party is so right-wing and, forgive me, just frankly racist. I mean, Vladimir Putin, I don't know how he thinks, but he might see that as a feature, not a bug. Next week in St. Petersburg, Russia's going to be hosting something called the International Russia Conservative Forum. They say they want to, quote, promote the establishment of a common, constant-acting Russian-European conservative elite group, uniting the political, industrial, economical, and religious elites in Russia and Europe. This is the second one of these international Russian conservative forums that Russia has hosted in the last few years. The first one was in 2015. It was sponsored by a branch of Putin's political party. It was also in St. Petersburg. That one in 2015 attracted American far-right racist fringe characters like Jared Taylor. He was a prolific pseudo-academic American white supremacist. You might remember him from the post-election alt-right gathering in Washington, D.C., where everybody did the Nazi salute and shouted, "Heil Trump." Oh, I'm sorry, they said it was "Hail Trump," not "Heil Trump." But you know, with the stiff-arm salute getting in the way of the camera lenses, it was kind of hard to read their lips and get that subtlety. Regardless of whether or not Russia likes the proto-fascism and the racism and the anti-Muslim bigotry of the Front National, regardless of whether or not that's the attraction, Russia definitely likes Marine Le Pen. And one thing I know they like about Marine Le Pen is that if she gets the presidency of France, she will do her damnedest to pry France out of Europe as well. Russia supports anything to increase the centripetal force that is pulling apart institutions of the West. Russia's overall goal in global strategy is to knock the United States down as many pegs as it can in terms of our global standing. And they want to disrupt and divide and undermine and hopefully split apart any Western alliances and international institutions that serve as a counterweight to them in the world, that in fact serve as defining any sort of international, small d, democratic, liberal values, Western order. All of the institutions that support that, Russia sees as the enemy. And they will do anything to undermine them as best they can. And when they have the advantage and when they have the momentum, they will take it. And that Russian idea of defeating your adversaries by splitting them up, by promoting divisions among them and within them, it seems almost ridiculous to think about it. But that strategy even extends to us as well. It even extends to us in the United States of America in a very specific way. You might have heard about the newly energized current iteration of the California secessionist movement, the California separatist movement. There have been low-key, low-profile kind of California insurrectionist movements for years. It's generally conservative parts of California that say California should split up and the liberal and urban and minority-heavy part of the state should be its own thing, while the conservative, rural, white part of California should become like a, southern Idaho or something. That kind of thing has existed for a long time. What's new in California is this surprisingly slick, online organized, moderate or even progressive-seeming effort that California as a whole should secede from the United States of America. I'm from California. My whole family lives in California. I know lots of people in California who have talked to me, half joking or not, about how appealing this Caliexit idea is since Donald Trump was elected president. But the leader of the organization that has spearheaded that movement, the leader of Yes California, he really does live in Russia. He lives in Siberia. Last September, the Yes California guy, who conveniently lives in Russia, the Caliexit guy, and also some right-wing Texas separatists all got invited to Moscow, to the Ritz Hotel in central Moscow for a Kremlin-funded conference called the Anti-Globalization Movement of Russia. And I know it sounds nuts. Look it up on Snopes.com if you don't believe me. There you will find links to the Embassy of the Independent Republic of California, with the tweet announcing its founding, half in English, half in Cyrillic, and an explanation from the Caliexit founder, who lives in Russia, that the separatist California embassy office space is being loaned to him in Moscow free of charge. He says he doesn't actually know who owns the office space. Maybe it's privately owned. He doesn't know. Maybe it's the Russian government. Who can tell? But it's sure nice to have free office space for his California separatist movement that he's running from Russia. That's a ridiculous story, right? That is a ridiculous idea. It is cartoonish, but it's real. And imagine if your goal was to take the United States down a few pegs in the esteem of the world, in terms of global leadership, in terms of the way the rest of the world looked up to the United States for help or for advice, or, conceivably as an exemplar of democracy, certainly as a pinnacle economic power. Imagine how helpful it would be if your goal was to erode all of that, to hurt all of that. Imagine how helpful it would be to that goal if you had a chance, even a slim chance, even a hilarious, cartoonish, tiny chance of splitting off from the United States, one of its 50 states, that on its own terms is the 6th largest economy in the world. You pry California off the United States, California literally has a bigger economy than France does. I mean, yeah, it would be nice to pry Germany out of the EU, pry France out of the EU. But you know what? The EU is splitting apart on its own. We'll do what we can to help, but let's think big. Theresa May is the British Prime Minister who will now be tasked with managing Britain pulling out of the European Union. She is not the politician who is credited with Britain's decision to leave the EU. That honor goes to Nigel Farage, who was the leader of the UK Independence Party, which spearheaded the Brexit campaign. Nigel Farage has become mildly famous in this country for his frequent appearances alongside Donald Trump and at Trump Tower and at the White House. Oddly, the day that WikiLeaks held its press conference to crow about the fact that they were releasing a devastating document dump that experts say essentially exposed the entire cyber arsenal of the CIA, on that same day, Nigel Farage was at the Embassy of Ecuador, where WikiLeaks founder Julian Assange lives, and from which he gave his press conference that day. A BuzzFeed News reporter saw Nigel Farage leaving the embassy that day and asked him what he was doing there. Nigel Farage responded by saying that he couldn't remember. He said he had no idea what he had just been doing inside that building. More recently, this past week, Nigel Farage has been in California, raising money among conservatives and Trump supporters in California to support California seceding from the United States, or at least splitting itself in two. Today, the Republican and Democratic senior members of that Senate Intelligence Committee. They announced that they've got 20 names on their list of people they want to talk to for their investigation into Trump and Russia. They hinted that former National Security Advisor Michael Flynn and former Acting Attorney General Sally Yates are among those 20 people. They confirmed that the president's son-in-law, Jared Kushner, will be one of the people who they speak to. On the House side, the House investigation may or may not be blowing up. We'll hear more about that tonight from Congressman Schiff. But that Senate investigation is going ahead. Their first public hearing will be tomorrow. It's not something you will want to miss if you're interested in this issue. But just one point about that. This last point I'm going to make. The Republican chairman of that committee, Richard Burr, confirmed today in no uncertain terms that there's one thing that committee will not be looking at. And that is the question of whether or not the Russian attack is over, whether Russia is still doing their thing, whether they are, in fact, basically collecting their payment from the Trump administration now in exchange for their part in throwing the election Trump's way. That the committee is not going to be looking at.
Can I ask, will you also be looking at the potential rewards Russia got for this, whether it's questions of changes to the Republican Party platform at the convention, or the way the president constantly refuses to criticize Vladimir Putin? Is that part of what you're looking at?
That's not in the scope of the investigation. I'll leave that up to you guys to report.